Hello and welcome back to the Zen Gateway podcasts, and today we're going to be looking at the subject of desire, and I've entitled this Unpacking Desire, and have done so because it's a subject that comes up obviously in connection with Buddhism, because the Buddha had a lot to say about it in the Four Noble Truths, which we'll be looking at in a moment, but also because it inevitably gives rise to questions in people's minds about what's wrong with desire anyway, which is a fair enough question. Quite often you get this sort of thing with, if I didn't obey my hunger, then I would starve to death. Sort of thing, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to say. And also, people might talk about animals as well having instincts, for procreation, for food, for shelter, for territory, etc. And obviously we have those impulses too. So, why are they sort of morally condemned? And I think a little bit as well, because of our own religious background here, desires and impulses have often been demonized in them, and we've been made to feel that somehow desires belong to the body, and that the body is something to be ashamed of, or something something morally wrong with it inherently, and it all gets mixed up with that as well. So I think there is some unpacking that can usefully be done here, because we need to be precise. And the great thing about Buddhism is that it has a technical language. The languages that it uses, Pali and Sanskrit, are languages that are good for philosophy, which we've talked about before, and for discussing philosophical concepts, and that allows for a certain amount of precision, so that we can actually understand what it is that the Buddha was talking about in the Four Noble Truths precisely. Of course, we always have this, lost in translation problem, don't we? Words get translated into approximations in other languages, and so the subtle meanings and nuances can be lost, and it can give rise to problems that in fact don't exist in in the original languages. And it's interesting. I mean, I've been reading a few things outside of Buddhism of late. Other people who've been talking about Buddhism, obviously read about the Four Noble Truths, and they've sort of said, well, what is wrong with desire anyway? It's ridiculous. There's something wrong with Buddhism, and we can end up dismissing Buddhism, which would be a mistake in my humble opinion, obviously, and also it would render 2,500 years of religious practices sort of brushed away, and obviously, if we're prepared to do that, then we probably need to stop, pause, and think, maybe I'm not quite understanding the message here. So let's go and have a look at this, and see if we can get to the bottom of what the Buddha meant and how he connected it with dissatisfactoriness, which is what we're translating as the term dukkha, that Sanskrit term. So let's go back to the Pali Canon. So we're going to have a look at an extract from the first sermon given by the Buddha, and this is the one where he delivers to the five ascetics the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. So this is what he says about the second noble truth, which is the noble truth on the origin of dukkha, origin of suffering or dissatisfactoriness. He says, "This, O monks, is the truth of the arising of suffering. It is this thirst or craving which gives rise to rebirth, which is bound up with passionate delight, and which seeks fresh pleasure now here and now there, in the form of thirst for sensual pleasure, thirst for existence, and thirst for non-existence." So, in fact, the Buddha is not even using the term desire. He's using the term thirst. Now, the Vedic Sanskrit term for this is trusna. I will apologise up front for my Sanskrit pronunciation. It's not that great. It has to be said, but it's TRSNA with various diacriticals on it, Trusna or Trusna, and in fact it does share the same etymological basis as the English word thirst. Trusna and thirst come from the same Indo-European word root, which is interesting already. So it suggests, at least to me, that the English term thirst has a much closer bearing on what the Buddha was in fact talking about. So when we have this idea of thirst, we have something now that is much stronger than, say, a want or a wish, i.e., what those words convey. It's something that's very emotionally charged. If we are really thirsty, the classic, man in a desert, as Alan Bennett, the playwright, once said, it's like asking a man in a desert whether he prefers Perrier or Buxton water. You know, that thirst is so powerful. It drives us, and so that drivenness is something perhaps that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at what the Buddha is actually talking about. So the other thing I just want to come on to now is because the other thing we likened it to was instinct, isn't it? We have this notion of instinct, that we have these natural instincts. So when we are thirsty, we want water. When we're hungry, we want food, shelter, security, procreation, all the rest of it. And these are the sort of instinctual terms that we have. Now, it's interesting that in early animal behavior studies, there is this notion called instinct crossing. And instinct crossing is like the switch that switches an instinct off. So instincts can be switched on and they can be switched off. And this you can see, if you look at those natural history films, some of those David Attenborough films, you see the sort of herds of zebra on the sort of African savannah, and they are grazing, and they migrate, to new grazing grounds, and they are sort of followed by a sort of ragtag army of predators, lions and leopards and cheetahs and hyenas and so on, wild dogs, and they are all just waiting for an opportunity to, bring down a zebra and have lunch. But the thing is that most of the time, when you see lions and so forth and big cats like that, they're actually spending most of the time sitting in the shade, not doing anything. And the reason that they're not doing anything, even though the zebra herd's, maybe 100 yards away, the reason they're not doing anything is that they're not hungry. And if they're not hungry, then the instinct to hunt doesn't arise. It's switched off. It's only when the feeling of hunger begins to arise, there's a drop in blood sugar or something like that, that the hunting instinct gets switched on, and that's when the big cat will then, get up from underneath its tree in its shade and will go out and try and do something about it. And the interesting thing is that they then go through this sort of whole chase, and let's say they're successful. I mean, 9 times out of 10 they're not, but let's say it's the one time when they are actually successful and they bring down their prey and they have lunch, and they don't sort of say, well, that was tasty, I'm going to have another one, and immediately go off and have another one, because having eaten, that switches off the instinct to go hunting. So for most animals, unless they're under some kind of duress or stress, their instinct actually is not a thirst. Their instinct is a sort of management system. It's a guidance system for living as a big cat. They do what they do when they need to, and their instincts sort of guide them, and by guiding their behaviour. So there's a sort of balance to it. They don't just sort of go berserk. Now, contrast this, for example, with somebody who compulsively eats or who compulsively doesn't eat. You can always trace an instinct back, maybe to do with hunger, or maybe in the second case to do with self-view or status. Self-view has to do with status, which is also linked to various drives. So that also although the instinctual drives still are there at the root of our desires and even our thirsts, they do not necessarily get switched on and switched off appropriately to the situation. There is a lack of instinct crossing, and this is something that makes instinct therefore different to what I want. Although there's a relationship, what I want has as its roots some kind of instinctual satisfaction. That's what it's working towards. It's not operating in the clean way as we've just seen with the lion. So here, actually, in this particular extract, the Buddha outlines or defines three types of thirst. The craving for passionate delight, which seeks fresh pleasure, now here, now there, in the form of thirst for sensual pleasure. That's pleasure of the senses. That is quite simply, we have a pleasant experience, and we want to repeat it, and then we want to repeat it, and we want to repeat it, and again and again and again. And there's a sort of compulsiveness that is beginning to accrue around it. This is what the Buddha is talking about, and this is when it becomes thirst. Notice that he says he's not actually saying that there's something wrong with enjoying a good meal, or having great sex. It's the thirst for it. That's what links it to the dissatisfactoriness. And then the other two forms are also obviously linked. This is thirst for existence and thirst for non-existence. So thirst for existence, these are more cognitive, actually, because these are about setting a goal in the future, and as it were, the goal is to attain an end state that will, so to speak, always be present, always be everlasting. This is the sort of happy ever after of the fairy tale. So, for example, in the classic story of in a fairy tale, to want to win the hand of the princess, or the prince, and be married and live happily ever after, that would be a thirst for a particular type of existence. In the case of the thirst for non-existence, then obviously it's usually around the avoidance of the unpleasant states of living that are not to be desired, and also therefore the fear of being lumbered with a situation, or in a relationship, in a job, in a home, that I really can't stand, that I really don't like and don't want to put up with. So these are the three forms of desire that the Buddha himself actually outlines. But in all three of them, he refers to not desire, but actually thirst. This term thirst itself, and again, this thirst has this compulsive edge to it, and a little bit, showing how this sort of thing takes a hold of us. I remember seeing many years ago a film with I think it was Michael Douglas in. And was it Kathleen Turner as well, called The War of the Roses. It was a sort of comedy, and Danny DeVito plays a divorce lawyer, and the two characters, the husband and wife. Well, it's about their love affair and whirlwind romance. They get married, they're very wealthy, they settle down, and then gradually, bit by bit, they fall out of love. They get sick of each other, they begin to grate and get on each other's nerves. But the problem is that neither of them wants to give up the lifestyle that they have together. They just don't want the other person to be there. So notice we have both a desire for existence and a desire for non-existence, based on the pleasure of living in a certain way, in a wealthy and affluent manner. So in fact, in a nice way, we've got all three of these thirsts operating. And so they start trying to undermine the other person. And there's a whole series of comedy routines based on tit for tat, spite, all sorts of things, and it's very funny because it's all very recognisable in ourselves as well. And Danny DeVito plays one of the divorce lawyer of the husband, and at one point Michael Douglas comes in because he told them that neither of them can leave the marital home. Whoever leaves it will lose it. So they both have to stay together, and that, of course, is the comedy setup. They can't get away from each other, and they can't stand each other. So that's where the tension arises, and the humour. And so at one point, Michael Douglas sort of rushes in, and he lays out a blueprint of the house, and he says to Danny DeVito, he says, all the rooms that are outlined in blue, that's where I live. All the rooms that are outlined in red, that's where she lives. And the rooms that are in yellow are the communal rooms. And these are the times that, these are the rotas that we have for who can be in that room and when. And Danny DeVito sort of looks at him and says, does this all sound rational to you? He goes, yeah, of course. It does, because when you really want something, actually, even the most ludicrous things sound fine. And now we begin to get, as it were, onto where the problem lies with thirst, because what happens is when we are in the grip of a powerful passion, like a thirst, either for existence or for non-existence, or for particular pleasure, we lose perspective of the context. We lose perspective of where we actually are, and this is what happens if you think about, for example, two people who are having a blazing row over something. They begin to talk nonsense after a while. It becomes so extreme. It just becomes sort of it becomes a case when actually it seems to ignore the circumstances and becomes what we would not, in colder blood, simply refer to as well, that's unreasonable, and then we get stuck on it. Then we get stuck on a point of view, and I won't budge, and come hell or high water, I won't budge. And it's interesting because we can often mistake that circumstance as a form of strength, but actually it becomes pig-headedness from another angle. And it becomes pig-headedness because it can get to the point where I will cut off my nose to spite my face. And the classic example of that is what's known as the monkey trap. And in the monkey trap, this is where in the jungles, when the hunter wants to catch a monkey, what does he do? He goes into the forest and to the place where the monkeys are, and there they all are up in the trees looking down at him. And he takes a breadfruit and he places it into the hollow of a tree trunk. And he's worked it out so that the breadfruit can just go through the hole in the trunk of the tree. And he knows that the monkeys will want the breadfruit. So he walks away. And he retires to a safe distance where the monkeys won't feel threatened by him. And once the monkeys feel that he's gone far enough away, one of them will come down to investigate and will put his hand into the hole in the trunk, and he can feel the breadfruit, and he tries to pull it out. But the thing is that the breadfruit in the monkey's hand makes it too big to pass through the hole. So although the monkey can just let go of the breadfruit and take his hand out, he wants that breadfruit. But because he wants that breadfruit, his hand with the breadfruit won't actually come out of that tree trunk. And all the hunter does is he lets that thirst in the monkey for that breadfruit build up, because the monkey has started investing energy in solving the problem of how to get that breadfruit out. And all he's waiting, all the hunter's waiting for, is for the monkey to be gripped by it. It comes to it. It's that feeling, isn't it? That come hell or high water, I'm going to damn well do this. And once the hunter has judged that the monkey is in that state, then he starts to walk towards the monkey. And of course, the other monkeys who are up in the trees watching the whole thing start giving the alarm signal for the monkey. But the monkey with the breadfruit is so insistent that he wants this that he's ignoring it. And in the end, the hunter simply has to walk up to the monkey and grab hold of him. At any point, that monkey could have let go of that breadfruit and escaped. But his trisna, his thirst, has led him to his doom. And that's probably, the classic example of what the Buddha was talking about. It's this getting stuck with. I remember another example of this in our human world, of a young footballer full of potential, and then he'd been spotted and trained, and he was just breaking into his career and was going to be an all-star, and it was in an accident and lost his foot, and he said, my life is over. And we can really sympathize with that, obviously. We can really sympathize with that. But what happens, of course, is that, in our own mind, we've created this self-image, and it's become everything that I am, to the point that everything else is excluded. And that exclusion of everything else is that over-focus, over-absorption, that trisna, that thirst, can create in us. So this is the link. This is how the Buddha linked that short-sightedness, really, that over-focus onto something, onto this one image, this goal image that we've projected into the future. That also, of course, projecting that image into the future casts a shadow back into the present. It means that the present life, without the desired thing, the thing that is craved, the thing that is hungered after, is simply not enough. Life without it, by definition, has to be dissatisfactory. There is no other way that any other form of living, any other form of satisfaction could possibly arise without this one thing. Do we see that narrowness that the trisna has driven us into? And this is why the Buddha said in that second noble truth that the trisna is what gives a rise, is the cause of that suffering. So is that it then? I mean, is it really that simple, that all our desires driven to an extreme, that's it? Well, no, it's not actually the whole story, because there is something else as well. Because elsewhere in the scriptures, when the Buddha is talking about the aspiration for nirvana, he says that the heart inclines towards nirvana, slides towards nirvana, leans towards nirvana. So here we have something that looks a little bit like a desire in a sort of way, if we look at it, maybe through half-closed eyes. It has a direction, it has a goal, it has an attainment, and the Buddha is sort of saying, this seems to be okay, this is a good thing. Yet on the other hand, we have this trisna, which is considered to be the source of suffering. So how does that all go together? How does that all actually work? Well, I think maybe to give that, unpack that a little bit more, or expand, amplify on that a little bit more, there is that nice analogy of the bamboo in China, high up in the mountains in the middle of winter. And high up on the mountain peaks in China, the snow can be 6 or 10 feet thick. And it lays there on the ground for 5 months of the year. And underneath that snow is the bamboo. And the bamboo is hidden underneath. Now, bamboo, as those of you who have it will know, that when it snows or when it rains, the snow catches it and it lays it down. The bamboo can lay itself flat onto the ground without damaging itself. Yeah, and the analogy is, or the poetic analogy is, that the bamboo lies under that snow waiting, and it's waiting for spring. And when that spring comes and it heats up and the snow melts, and the bamboo simply stands upright again. So the bamboo, if you like, its nature, it wants to stand upright and reach the sun so it can grow up. But now it reaches circumstances, adverse circumstances, that do not allow it to happen. However, the urge is still there. However, there is no thirst. It doesn't fight or rage against the snow. It doesn't scapegoat the snow as evil, pernicious, and mine enemy. It simply bides its time because it knows that this is the natural round of the seasons. And when the snow melts, then up it comes again. And so we talk about the heart's desire, or perhaps a little bit more cleanly, we could talk about the heart's aspiration. That the heart itself, as it were, our own individual nature, does have an aspiration at its heart, but that this aspiration is not necessarily afflicted by tryzna, is not afflicted by this compulsive thirst that I must have, I must have, I must have. And so this creates something very different. This creates, as it were, a natural inclination, a movement towards. As long as that being is in existence, it will always move in a particular direction and not just randomly. However, as such, there isn't my intention behind it. And that's the important thing, because intention also plays an important part in Buddhism as well. We have right intention, for example, in the Noble Eightfold Path. It's the second stage on the Noble Eightfold Path, right intention. And this often has to do with the intention to set out on the Buddha's path in the first place. But when we come to the Mahayana, say to Master Rinzai says in one of his sermons, all intention misses the target. All intention misses the target. And also we have, obviously, in Chinese thinking, from Taoism as well, what's called Wu Wei, which is sometimes translated as non-action, but actually, more accurately, it means non-intentional action. So again, we have this idea that actions can be non-intentional, and that doesn't mean that they're sort of random or just mere reflex. It means that they are under the guidance of the heart's desire, but they're not under the attachment of I. There's no attachment to them. And so they're allowed to flow and manifest in the circumstances according to the circumstances. And if the circumstances don't allow that flowing, no suffering has to arise as a consequence. It simply waits. But as soon as opportunity arises again, then it moves in the direction of the aspiration. And so it's like a current. It moves according to its inclinations, but not in a forced or driven or an obsessive way. And this is how we can begin to perhaps think a little bit differently about this difference between the life force inclination and the self-created my inclination as well. And it shows itself up because quite often what happens is that that those inclinations, if they become overlaid with I, if the I is very strong, then wishes begin to arise that actually produce symptoms. And I can think of a couple of examples of that. One is I remember an old boss of mine who she was unhappy in her work, and in a way she was prevented from doing the work that she wanted to do, that she wished to do, that was aligned with obviously her own inclination, and this upset her. And this upset um, was because obviously she rather like the War of the Roses. She was stuck in the workplace. She didn't want to leave the workplace at that time. She felt she didn't want to be driven out of it for various reasons, and so she couldn't leave the circumstances, and yet neither could she satisfy herself in them either. So there was that tension. And when she did finally leave, because in the end she did, and we spoke about it, and I said, when did the penny drop? When was that moment you made the decision? She said, I suddenly realized after quite a while that I got into the habit of calling in at the sandwich shop on the way to work, and I would order a bacon sandwich and bring it in, and I would eat it at work, even though I'd had breakfast before I left. And the reason that I did that was not because I was hungry, because I wanted breakfast, was because I wanted to make myself feel better. I wanted to feel a small pleasure before, the the difficulties of the day would begin. And she said, I suddenly realized that desire was, that's not the way to live. It's a temporary pleasure. It's a sensual pleasure, but actually what it's doing is it's hiding a deeper malaise, a deeper problem, and I needed to address that problem. So in that way, the bacon sandwich, the wish, the desire for a bacon sandwich was a symptom of a deeper malaise, and that can operate like that too. So we need to be aware of it. So in this way, then, we actually can investigate those desires, because those desires themselves become revealers of truth. Just as she investigated that desire for a bacon sandwich and realized there was a deeper problem unaddressed underneath. So our desires too, we can have a look at them, which is, again, is not to, we don't have to become over analytical on this. Quite often we find from our own emotional reactions, they act as the guides for us. If we have a powerful emotional reaction about something, then it sort of should ring an alarm bell. We should say, now that needs investigating. So, for example, I remember again, Venerable Myokyo-ni, she was giving a talk at the Buddhist Society, and there was a gentleman there who really wanted to come and hear her. But he was told that when he went into the room, because it was laid out as a zendo, he would have to bow to the Buddha, and he really didn't want to bow to the Buddha. And so she said to him in the end, if you're not prepared to bow to the Buddha, because that is the form for going into a zendo, then we're not going to let you in. And he was appalled. He was agog. But she was quite firm about it, and in the end he chose to leave rather than to bow. But she said she saw him sometimes after that. Whenever she gave a talk at the Buddhist Society, and it was in a lecture hall, which meant that you didn't have to bow to go in, he was always there. So he wanted to come and hear her talk about the Dharma. He clearly felt an affinity, but he was cut off from it. Because he couldn't pass that hurdle of the bow. And as she said if he wasn't prepared to, she wasn't criticizing him for having that reaction, for whatever reason, maybe perfectly justifiable, that he had this reaction. It absolutely stuck in his craw that he had to bow to the Buddha. She didn't know his background. Maybe he'd had a terrible, terrible experience. But if he wasn't prepared to face that issue, or at least be willing to face that issue, then, as she said, there's nothing the Buddha Dharma can do for him. If we're always prepared to say this but no further, then then it means we can go no further than that. It means we're not prepared to look, and that means we are colluding with our unconsciousness. And as Buddhism is about becoming more conscious, then obviously we're going to run into difficulty. So we'll leave that there for now. So hopefully that has created a few more ways of looking at this subject of desire or craving or trusna, thirst, as the Buddha called it.